I've been on this creaking ocean straddling base for over a month now, healing up while I wait on High Commissar Lomax. She's never liked me, and I doubt my unauthorized sojourn in the wilderness will have improved her opinion much. She'll want answers, but where do I begin? How can I explain the path that led me to those Vizranti deserters when I don't understand it myself? How can I make her believe I was on the trail of Commander Wintertide when I'm not sure I believe it myself? Perhaps she'll have me shot, or perhaps she'll just do it herself. But no, I've been given a new eye and a new arm, so execution won't be on her agenda. Did I say new? In truth, both the augmentics are ancient, doubtless salvaged from one other corpse. The hand is a tarnished metal gauntlet that grinds whenever I flex the fingers, and locks up unless I keep it lubricated. But the optic is worse. It's like an iron spike rammed into my eye socket, a hollow iron spike with an angry wasp trapped inside it. Not that I'd give a damn if it worked properly, but sometimes things flicker or flare, and suddenly I see the world through a harsh snow, or broken down to a crude mosaic of reality. And sometimes I'll see things that aren't there at all. It's just as well I've learned to recognize true ghosts. Take Neiman, for example. He has stood vigil at the foot of my bed throughout my time in the infirmary, invisible to the medics and orderlies, but occasionally glimpsed by the worst of the wounded. A few days ago they wheeled in a man who looked like a heap of raw meat, and I saw him staring at my revenant in abject terror. Doubtless the dying man thought the shade had come for his soul. He could not know Neiman cares only for me. Detlef Neiman is the last of my three ghosts, yet his hate runs the deepest. He was always a cold bastard, the kind of man who brought nothing but malice to the commissariat. I once believed that our kind were exemplars of the Imperium, unflinching in the face of death and faithful to a fault. How else could we be trusted with the power of life and death over our charges? We have to be the best of the best, Iverson, my mentor Bierce used to say, knowing full well that few of us ever were. Even so, Neiman was amongst the worst of the worst. He was assigned to me on my first tour of the mire, and although he was just a cadet back then, I could see the darkness hiding behind his pale, colorless eyes. He was morbidly proud of his 6 executions he had already made, and took every opportunity to regale me with the details. I loathed him from the start, and never understood why he was so reverent of me, a 20-year veteran with a paltry 10 executions to my name. When he finally earned the Scarlet and took his own commission, his departure was like a shadow lifting from my soul. The next time our paths crossed, we were equals, joint commissars serving with the 12th Galanti Gurkhas, and the Kroot-infested tributaries of De La Rosa Magenta. By then Neiman had tailed almost 200 executions, taking a life for even the slightest misendeavor amongst his charges. Iverson, you think too much, he chided whenever I confronted him, echoing Bierce's old omissions. You and I are energies of the God Emperor's will, unshackled from doubts and passions that enslave lesser men. Hesitation can be our only crime. That icy facade never fooled me for an instant. I see how much he enjoyed the killing. That was why I left him to the Kroot. How did it happen? We were lost deep in the mire when he took a wound to the gut, a solid slug that tore him right open. He pleaded with me to carry him, or make a clean end of it. Instead, I shot off both of his hands so he couldn't do it himself. I walked away. I remember him begging and cursing, and then finally screaming when the Xenos found him. You see, the Kroot are particularly foul lapdogs of the Blueskins. They are avian carnivores that delight in tearing their enemies apart and eating their flesh, and not always in that order. I suppose Neiman's return was inevitable, but I underestimated his poison. One way or another, he damned me. After he came back, I grew increasingly careless, with the final resort, almost trebling my executions in the space of 2 years, and thinking nothing of it. Thinking nothing much of it, in fact, at all, until Indigo George, and number 27, the girl with the eyes of a saint. After that, everything changed. Iverson's journal. But you can't come in here, the young dropship pilot blustered, his eyes agog at the antique auto pistol in the intruder's hand. The shipboard regulations are quite unequivocal about... Nothing's ever unequivocal, son. Except the man pointing a gun in your face, said the white-haired madman, who had burst the cockpit. And maybe the Emperor's word, though I'm none too sure about that one right now. Besides, the man is already here, Jamie, the co-pilot observed languidly, and I'd wager he'll not be going away anytime soon. Colonel Cutler turned to the youth in the pilot's chair, and the much older man lounging in the seat beside him. The co-pilot's thinning gray hair was tied back in a drooping ponytail, giving him the air of a faded rake. The mahogany skin was deeply seamed, and the bags under his eyes mirrored the sagging sack of his gut. Cutler guessed he was well past 60, and looked every day of it. "Your name, sir?" the colonel asked, unable to decipher the letters on the rogue's crumpled jumpsuit. "That would be Ortega." The co-pilot's cadence was almost satirical, the voice of a man who enjoyed talk for talk's sake. "And that's Ortega, pilot 3rd class and falling, 33rd Verzanthi Sky Shadows, indentured into the glorious 6th Tempest, in service to His Holiness, the esteemed Water Dragon. May his exalted bones bless this pestilential snake pit into eternity." "Son, why don't you just fly the ship and leave the talking to us oldsters?" Cutler said, waving his pistol at Jamie. Indignantly, the pilot returned his attention to the helm, and swore at the blinking red light that indicated yet another clogged engine filter. The dropship was submerged in the effluvium of the strangle zone, Phaedra's miserable excuse for a cloud layer. Flying through the dense strata of floating fungal detritus was dirty work, but dropping below the smog was far more dangerous. The fleet had lost countless birds to enemy sky snipers, high-altitude drones armed with lethal railguns. With expert fingers, the pilot flickered a sequence of switches and flushed the filter. The red light winked, and he sighed with relief. It was Ortega's job to supervise the filters, but the fool couldn't be trusted with anything these days. Jamie had reported his laxity many times, but the Sky Corps was short of airmen, and Ortega had escaped with the demotion. More importantly, the report had earned Jamie the Silver Badge of Skywatch, an honor awarded only men of impeccable loyalty. Unfortunately, the old goat's retribution had been a vigorous campaign of flatulence that had turned the cockpit into a toxic no man's land to rival the smog outside. With any luck, which would soon run out, Jamie would be assigned some younger and more devoted. It was the natural order of things. There was no room for broken relics in a holy war. The metal gangway crashed down on the shore, and Ambrose Templeton, captain of the 4th Company, lurched from the boat. Still reeling from the boiling embrace of the sea, he stood blinking on the ramp, trying to make sense of the chaos that was the beach, searching for words. Blind, bound, and broken heartless, dancing eyeless to a symphony of sorrows. Templeton had written those words on the killing fields of Yosemite Falls, scrawling them feverishly into a notebook with blood-slick hands, diverting the horror to the page before it could drown his sanity. Beneath his gaudry finery, the captain was a gray man, sallow-faced and balding. But beneath the gray, he was a riot of restless words. Before the Providence Uprising, he'd been an assiduous historian of warfare, poring over the strategies of the past to inform the tactics of the future. The discipline had served him well during the conflict, and the scholar had become a fine officer. And at the time, the fine officer had become a fair poet. After Yesamane, Templeton had come to see the material cost of war as material for its own epic, his Canticle of Crows. Carrion hawks, circling in strident contemplation of man's fathomless loss. Lieutenant Throne staggered from the boat behind Templeton and slipped, sending them both fumbling to the beach. The captain thrust his hands out to catch his fall and felt them punch through something soft and brittle that exploded in a crowd of liquid fader. Choking and spluttering, he found himself straddling a fleshy fungus that looked like a crude parody of a man. Then he saw the dull eyes staring up at him from the violent balloon of its face, saw the distended jaws rammed open by the gnarled toadstool erupting from within, saw the gleaming dog tags engraved into its bloated neck. By a small miracle, his spectacles hadn't slipped loose, and could even read the name of the fungus, Fulmer C.A., Corporal. Templeton squinted in confusion, trying to make sense of it, hunting for a metaphor. Like bittersweet flowers of boundary, the dead shall bloom, and the blossoms shall devour those that linger at the threshold. And then he saw Fulmer's skin rippling and quaking as he felt something nipping at his hands inside the rib cage. Nearby, Thone was screaming, and Templeton felt an echo welling up inside himself. If he let that scream out, he knew it would never end, and so he had to drown it out with more. Where's the snare and bury and deny all the sins that... "On your feet, Captain Bloodbait!" The voice was guttural and thick, with the accent of the battleship crew. Lethan, Templeton recalled through his rising panic. The speaker grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet, tearing his hands free of the corpse in an eruption that splattered his glasses with ichor. He tried to wipe the slime away, but his hands were knocked sideways, and someone began to brush him down urgently. Through a liquid haze, he could see dozens of pale, coin-sized grubs being swept from his sleeves. The vermin were all shells and pincers and thorny tendrils, something between a crab and a jellyfish. Several clung stubbornly to his hands, fighting to burrow into his flesh, but his rescuer tore them off with practiced efficiency. "The dead! They're filled with the scrabs!" The Lethan laughed harshly. "Mostly they only bite, but it's not good to be bleeding inside a meat bag." Behind the voice, Templeton could hear his men cursing as they deployed to the beach. Lieutenant Thone was shrieking like a madman, and Sergeant Brennan was bawling at him to stand still. Lubin, his Vox operator, was praying in breathless staccato rhythm. Behind, the familiar voices, he could hear distant shouts and cries punctuated by the clatter of steam bloods and the shrill baying of whistles. "It's done," said Lethan. "Welcome to Della Rosa Breach, Captain Bloodbait." Wiping the slime from his glasses, Templeton peered at his savior and groaned inside. Another damnable commissar. This planet was crawling with them. Under a quagmire of scars and sores, the fellow looked too young for the role, but there was no mistaking his black storm coat and high-peaked cap, though both were threadbare. Like the commissars on the battleship, he'd woven razor wire into the blue band of his cap and epaulets, ornamenting his faith with the promise of pain. Pinned to his lapel, alongside the traditional imperial aquila, was an unusual silver icon, a diamond-shaped eye, framed with angular wings. Templeton had never seen anything like it, but every regiment had its own traditions, and the ram's skull of the 19th probably looked equally peculiar to the commissar. "I am Commissar Cadet I am Commissar Cadet Zainton Zook of the Letharian Minor Corps, the young announced, gesticulating fiercely to punctuate his words. The brass whistle hanging from his cap bobbed about in accompaniment. Before Templeton could answer, Thone lurched towards him, clutching at his coat with beseeching hands. The lieutenant was still screaming, and Templeton caught a glimpse of his eyes glittering through a writhing crustacean carpet. To his horror, Templeton realized the man was covered in the creeping, clawing scabs. Instinctively, he reached out to help, but Rydick shoved him aside and launched a brutal kick at Thone, sending the hapless officer reeling to the ground. A moment later, the commissar's auto pistol barked and silenced the screams. Was too late for that one, yes? Rydick grinned at Templeton, exposing blackened teeth that had been filed to sharp points. And the Emperor, he condemns. Templeton recognized the praise from the Lethan battleship. The savage confessor had uttered the same words after he'd murdered poor Alias Waite. The injustice was still burning a hole in Templeton's heart, but recriminations would have to wait. Back there on the battleship, capitulation had been their only option. It had been a crisis for all of them. Only Templeton had grasped the extent of the confessor's madness and seen his regiment's peril. Just like the Hellfire Puritans back home, the Lethans had turned the sharp, cleansing blade of the imperial gospel into something twisted. There could be no reasoning with such men. Once again, Templeton thanked Providence he'd been able to vox a warning to the colonel during the sea crossing. What Cutler would do with the warning was anybody's guess, but at least he wouldn't be coming in blind. Even so, Templeton sensed nothing could prepare a newcomer for this world. There was a sickness here that ran deeper than the stench and the vermin, a malaise that could rot away a man's very soul. But there was also inspiration here. Gazing across the open graveyard of the beach, Templeton felt his soul ignite with the imagery of his dark saga. Where the sea of sewage ended, the sea of decay began, drowning the shore in a swath of death. Corpses were strewn everywhere. Deposited in geological sediments of corruption, the bleached skeletons of the first wave buried beneath the suppurating efflorescence of the last. Captain Bloodbait, the commissar snapped at him. The Emperor, he demands the courage. Templeton turned to him. Or the Emperor condemns? Is so, yes, Rydick agreed. Now get your new bloods off beach, before the scrabs eat 'em all. He gave Templeton a comradely slap on the shoulder, and jerked the whistle to his lips. Sergeant Calhoun heard the shrill whistle blast, and yelled at his squad to shift their arses. There were at least 3 of the snakebite commissars prowling the shore, pouncing on the new arrivals as they spilled from the boats, bawling and cussing at the muddled men. He'd already seen 2 graybacks and an officer gunned down, and he was damned if he'd lose anyone to the bloodthirsty blackcoats. Boone lumbered past with Toomey slung over his broad shoulders. Catching a glimpse of the broken man's bloody scalp, Calhoun swore viciously. It was a hell of a thing to lose one sniper before the bullets even started to fly. It just gets better and better, don't it, Sarge? Called Roach as he sped past, dancing nimbly between the corpses. Calhoun shook his head, taking it all in. The beach was a screwed-up hellhole. But when all was said and done, things could have been much worse. It looked like the 19th had arrived on the tail end of some really bad stuff, after the fighting had already moved inland. This coastline had already been captured, and the corpses choking the shores had paid the price. Shh. No more mischief. No more mischief. No more mischief. Shh. Everyone was off the boats now, racing towards the distant tree line, but he hadn't seen the green cap go past. Stubbornly, he refused to acknowledge his anxiety. Despite what Maud had said, he wasn't convinced the boy was his. The kid seemed too creed-struck to be a genuine Calhoun. Even so, he couldn't deny this relief when Joyce emerged from the boat. The boy paused on the ramp, gazing at the shore with a faraway look. "What in seven hells are you doing back there, green cap?" Calhoun hollered. Joyce turned his distant eyes on him, and Calhoun saw something almost furtive in the expression. The boy leapt to the shore and saluted smartly. "Just checking something out, Sergeant Calhoun, sir," he said. Calhoun was about to question him further when Dick started shrieking. "Looks like Brother Dix is in need of some salvation, sir." Joyce pointed further up the beach, and Calhoun grimaced. Too damn right, Brother Dix was in need of salvation. The rangy Badlander was struggling frantically to free his foot from the clean carcass he'd trodden in. Cursing, Calhoun stalked over and hauled the idiot out of the rotten mire. "Get it together, Grayback," Calhoun bellowed. "I'm not pulling your Grox feet out of every meat bag on this beach." "It ain't right, Sarge. It ain't right to just leave him here like trash. Thousands of 'em gone to feed the shrooms and the grubs. Like meat candy." The words bubbled out in a manic stream that told Calhoun the man was heading on the edge. "I'll feed you right to him right now if you can't." Calhoun slapped Dix across the face, hard. The grayback stared at him, stupidly, and Calhoun slapped him again, catching him as he stumbled. "Are we done here, Trooper Dix?" Dix nodded uncertainly, still sniveling. Calhoun snorted and thrust Modine's flamer towards him, but the Badlander jerked away, as if he was offering a venomous snake. "He'd want you to have it," Calhoun said stiffly. "You're going to dishonor the man, Trooper?" "No, Sarge. You got it all wrong." There was a pleading look in Dix's eyes. "See, Cleet, he'll be back real soon. Just like them cogboys promised. I ain't touching his girl." "I'll take her, Sergeant," Joyce said, startling Calhoun. He hadn't seen the boy come up alongside him. "I did some practicing with the burners in basic, and they told me I got a gift for it. I always loved the sacred burnings back home. There's a holiness in fire you can't get from a bullet." That serene gaze was back in the boy's eyes, and Calhoun found himself feeling oddly uneasy. "You still with us, boy?" he asked gruffly, feeling awkward. "I'm just fine, Sergeant." Joyce reached for the flamer, and Calhoun found himself handing it over. The green cap slung the bulky fuel canister over his shoulder and smiled happily. "And Lady Hellfire is going to be just fine, too." Captain John Milton Machen loped up the beach, the pistons of his colossal thundersuit bellowing and wheezing fiercely in the heat. The machine armor was a cantankerous old monster, but he knew it would never fail him. Like Machen himself, it was too full of bile and spite to lie down and die, too hungry for war. Prentice and Wade kept pace with him on either flank, leaping over the corpses in their lighter storm suits, while Machen simply waded through them, pounding the dead into pulp beneath his iron boots. He'd lost contact with Gledhill and Ash, but the rest of the Zouaves had signed in on the intrasuit Vox. They were scattered across the beach, supporting the Arkan infantry like hardpoints in a tapestry of soft meat. His iron knights. He surged past the blackened husk of a tank, catching sight of the yawning cavity in its hull. It was just one of the countless broken hulks littering the beach. He'd clocked dozens of Chimera transports and Hellhound tanks, even a couple of heavier machines he didn't recognize, all shredded to scrap metal, and a mute testament to the power of the enemy munitions. There was no clue to the identity of the tank killers, but he knew that even glancing Even a glancing shot from one of those mystery guns would obliterate his armor in an instant. The thought made him uncomfortable, and he felt suddenly vulnerable, out on the open coral. He didn't fear death, but he wouldn't welcome a fool's end. Finally, he saw the jungle looming over the coral dunes, the tangled wall of foliage that looked like it had been dredged up from the seabed and left to rot in the sun. Wherever he looked, he saw stems and stalks, and bladders and tendrils, puffed up with a fleshy, unclean vitality that had sickened him and urged him to burn and burn. Lovingly he stroked the trigger of his flamer, and a screaming torrent of fire laced from behind the dunes, immolating a cluster of cancerous trees. A moment later, a second stream leapt alongside the first, then another and another, uniting in a blazing, cleansing wave that surged through the jungle. It was as if the Emperor himself had granted Machen's desire to burn. Puzzled, the captain crested a final dune and saw the base. The Lathans had only offered a cursory briefing on the battleship, but they'd mentioned Dolorosa Beach. It was the only Imperial base in the southern archipelago, a ragtag camp manned by the remnants of several decimated regiments. There were at least 20 Hellhound tanks down there, stretching out along the tree line, their inferno cannons shrouded in steam as they cooled down. Scattered along the flame tanks were dozens of chimeras and a pair of Lehman Russ Vanquishers. Machen scowled at their slipshod formations. They were spaced almost randomly and weren't even facing the jungle. Behind the mechanized perimeter, things looked even worse. The outpost was a sprawling shantytown of tents and makeshift huts that had obviously grown without any central defensive planning. There were at least 1,000 men bustling around the camp, and there was no cohesion or discipline to them. The troops were clustered up in their original regiments, still bound and doubtless divided by their older allegiances. Their uniforms spanned countless traditions, ranging from simple khaki fatigues to faded velvet finery to rusting suits of armor. Machen even spotted a gaggle of dark-skinned warriors galloping along the perimeter on horseback, whooping manically as they raced each other between the flames. To the captain's rigorous eyes, it was absolute chaos. By the golden throne, the dust snakes will fit in right here with this rabble, Machen thought grimly. "Do we go in, sir?" Wade voxed, his disgust mirroring Machen's own. The captain had stopped on the dune, and the rest of the company were catching up and fanning out on either side of him, waiting for his orders. Further along, he saw young Lieutenant Grayburn leading the second company towards the outpost, while the dreamer Templeton lagged halfway up the beach with the fourth. And there was still no word from the colonel and his vaunted burning eagles. Doubtless, the old man was still fooling around with his Norlander witch, while his regiment was thrown to the wolves, leaving John Milton Machen to pick up the pieces. The hellhounds roared again, and their stubby inferno cannons doused the jungle in a fresh wave of fire. Watching that filthy tangle burn, Machen grinned and boosted the output of his shoulder speakers, assaulting the dunes with a riot of martial chords. This war was a mess, but it would offer countless opportunities for a man who cared only for vengeance. "Of course we're going in," Machen bellowed. "We didn't cross the damn stars that rust in this throne-forsaken hill.